girl's scream pierces the silent, stone corridors of Pembroke Castle on a winter night in 1457. It is a sound that seems to tear the very fabric of the night, a raw, primal thing that cuts through the howling wind like a blade through silk. In a chamber lit only by the frantic dance of candle flames, Lady Margaret Beaufort, barely 13 years old, grips the bloodied sheets beneath her. Her small body convulses with a pain no child should ever endure, a relentless agony that has already stretched for hours. The midwives, their faces carved into grim masks by the shifting shadows, whisper frantic prayers in Latin, their words a desperate chorus against the looming presence of death itself. Outside, a blanket of snow falls, smothering the frozen Welsh landscape in an eerie, silent stillness. Yet inside this room, a future is being forged in fire and blood. A future. King of England is being torn from a girl who is barely more than a child herself. A cruel paradox playing out on a bed of straw and linen. Margaret's sweat-drenched hair clings to her face like a shroud as another wave of agony crashes over her, stealing her breath and her voice. They think she is dying. The whispers in the room are not just of prayer, but of resignation. The baby is too large. Her hips, those of a child not yet finished growing, are too narrow. At 13, her body is a bud forced violently to bloom. Yet here she labors, a pawn in a grand, brutal game, to bring forth the son who will one day sit upon the throne of England as Henry VII. The historical irony is a bitter taste in the mouths of those present. This child, born of such unimaginable suffering, is destined to end the bloodiest conflict in English history, the Wars of the Roses, and found the Tudor dynasty, a line that will reshape the world. But in this moment, there is no destiny, only a child suffering. The air is thick with the metallic scent of blood and the cloying sweetness of fear, a perfume of sacrifice that will cling to this room for centuries. The girl writhing in that bed, lost in a storm of pain, was no ordinary noble maiden. Lady Margaret Beaufort carried within her veins the potent, dangerous blood of kings, a direct descendant of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster. Himself a son of the mighty King Edward III, but royal blood, as Margaret's short life had already taught her, was a double-edged sword, both a blessing and a profound curse. In the savage political landscape of 15th century England, where the Wars of the Roses would soon tear the realm apart in a bloody feud between Lancaster and York, such a bloodline made you a commodity. It marked you as either a valuable pawn to be traded or a dangerous threat to be eliminated. Margaret's path to that blood-soaked birthing chamber began not in Wales, but years earlier and miles away, when she was still a child, her world confined to the sunlit gardens and echoing halls of Bletsoe Castle. It was a childhood that would be brutally short-lived. Born in 1443 to the formidable John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, she entered a world where loyalties were as shifting as desert sands, and a daughter's primary value was in the alliance her marriage could cement. Her father, a man broken by the relentless tides of war, died when she was barely a year old. The official story spoke of a sudden fever, but the court corridors hummed with darker theories. Some said it was by his own hand, the weight of military defeats in France during the dying days of the 100 Years, war crushing his spirit into dust. Others whispered the single ever-present dread of the nobility, poison. For in those treacherous times, whispers of poison followed every unexpected death like vultures circling a dying beast. John Beaufort had watched, helplessly as territories won by the legendary Henry V slipped through his fingers. The shame, the disgrace, it ate at him from the inside. When he returned to England in 1444, he was a ghost of a man, hollow-eyed, his hands trembling not with age but with despair. He was found dead in his chambers, whether by blade, poison, or simply the unbearable weight of failure. He was gone, leaving his infant daughter to navigate a world that had already claimed him. Margaret's mother, the Dowager Duchess, was a woman tempered by this harsh reality. She understood the brutal rules of survival with chilling clarity. There was no time for extended mourning. There was only the relentless pursuit of security. And so, by the time Margaret was a mere 6 years old, her childhood was officially over. She was betrothed to John de la Pole, the son of the powerful and feared Duke of Suffolk. It was a cold, calculated transaction on parchment, a contract designed to bind two of England's most powerful families in an alliance that seemed, on the surface, unbreakable. But in the Game of Thrones, politics moved faster than childhood. The landscape could shift in an instant. And when the Duke of Suffolk fell from the dizzying heights of royal favor into the abyss in 1450, that carefully written betrothal became nothing more than worthless paper. His crime was political. Negotiating a marriage for the king and the surrender of English lands to France, terms that enraged a nation. His punishment was a testament to the era's brutality. Dragged from his ship, he was forced to kneel on a gunwale and beheaded with a rusty sword. The job so botched it took half a dozen clumsy, savage blows. The message to the Beaufort women was clear. Survival was not about strength alone. It was about adaptability, about reading the political winds and bending without breaking. Adapt they did. Her next betrothal was arranged with swift, ruthless efficiency, this time to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond. Edmund was a different kind of prospect. He was half-brother to the mentally frail King Henry VI, but his family, the Tudors, were viewed as Welsh upstarts, their legitimacy often questioned by the old blue-blooded aristocracy. But they possessed one thing that mattered more than ancient lineage: the king's current favor. In 1455, when Margaret was just 12 years old, the marriage was solemnized at Bletsoe Castle. The Great Hall was decorated with tapestries depicting the heroic deeds of her Beaufort ancestors, a constant reminder of the weight she now carried. Edmund Tudor was a man in his 20s, already hardened by the realities of war and court intrigue. Margaret, standing beside him, was a child still growing into her body, drowning in the fabric of her wedding gown. There was no courtship, no gentle wooing. The marriage was consummated immediately, for there was no concept of waiting for physical or emotional maturity in an age when noble girls were treated as broodmares for dynastic ambitions. The wedding night was a trauma that Margaret would bury deep, a private horror she never spoke of in her later, more powerful years. But the evidence of its impact would be written indelibly across her life, in the permanent damage to her young body and in the lifelong, almost obsessive religious devotion that would become her refuge and her armor. Within months of her wedding, Margaret's body began to change in ways that both mystified and terrified her. The older women around her spoke in hushed, knowing tones about her condition, their faces a confusing mix of joy for the potential, Lancastrian air and genuine, palatable concern for the vessel that carried it. Margaret's own mother watched her daughter's growing belly with a deep, chilling anxiety. She had been 18 when Margaret was born, a woman grown, old enough to survive childbirth with relative safety. At 12, soon to be 13, Margaret was attempting a feat that was a known killer, a brutal lottery that had claimed countless women far older and physically stronger than she was. But the wheel of fate was turning, and Edmund Tudor would never live to see the outcome. In the autumn of 1456, while campaigning in Wales against the rising power of the Yorkist forces, Edmund was captured at Carmarthen Castle. The circumstances of his capture and subsequent death remain shrouded in the thick fog of civil war and political intrigue. Some accounts suggest he was taken in a surprise attack, his forces scattered and outmaneuvered. Others, more sinister, hint at betrayal from within his own ranks, a blade in the dark sold for Yorkist gold. The official story, released by his captors, was conveniently simple. He had succumbed to the plague, a common and unprovable killer in the filthy, cramped conditions of a medieval prison. But contemporary chroniclers noted the suspicious speed of his decline and the pointed refusal of his captors to allow any independent physicians to attend him. The truth died with him. What is certain is that by November 1456, the news reached a 13-year-old Margaret. She was a widow, pregnant with a posthumous heir, and utterly terrifyingly alone in a world that was tipping over the precipice into all-out civil war. Into this void of terror stepped a figure who would become her protector. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's fiercely loyal younger brother. His decision to take responsibility for his pregnant sister-in-law was a blend of chivalry and cold, hard practicality. Margaret carried not just a child, but the potential heir to the Tudor name, the last flickering ember of their family's royal connection. He could not leave her to the wolves. He brought her to his formidable stronghold at Pembroke Castle in Wales, a fortress that seemed to grow from the very cliffs, its massive stone walls a promise of protection from the gathering storm. But the journey to Pembroke in her advanced state of pregnancy was a trial in itself. The winter roads were a special kind of hell, rutted with frozen mud, blocked by fallen trees, and haunted by bands of armed men whose loyalties were unknown and therefore deadly. Margaret traveled in a horse-drawn litter, a torturous contraption where each jolt and bump sent sharp, shooting pains through her swollen, unprepared body. A journey that should have taken 2 days stretched into a grueling 5-day ordeal. A pilgrimage of fear that ended at the foot of the castle that would forever mark her. Upon their arrival, the castle's physician, Dr. Lewis Caerleon, a man of rare learning, having studied at the great universities of Oxford and Paris, examined her. His alarm grew with every passing moment. He confided his grim prognosis to Jasper Tudor in hushed, serious tones. "The child is positioned badly, my lord," he would have said, his voice low. "And her hips. They are too narrow, too childlike. The birth will be dangerous. It may very well be fatal." It was a death sentence, whispered in the language of medicine, as Margaret struggled through the dark, confining winter months, waiting for the inevitable. A profound change began to occur within her. The terrified girl began to recede, and a new, steely version of Margaret began to emerge. She displayed a maturity that belied her years, spending her time questioning Jasper and his advisors, learning everything she could about the tangled web of English politics and the brutal art of statecraft. She understood instinctively that in the struggles to come, knowledge would be a sharper weapon than any sword. Alongside this political awakening, she threw herself into religious study with an intensity that worried her attendants, seeking solace and strength from a higher power, perhaps preparing for her own mortality. And then on that fateful January night in 1457, the waiting ended. Margaret's labor began with a pain that doubled her over, a crushing force that stole the air from her lungs. She had been walking the castle battlements, taking the cold, bracing exercise that Dr. Caerleon insisted was necessary, when the first contraction struck, a tearing sensation deep within that promised nothing but suffering. The midwives, experienced women who had presided over the mysteries of life and death countless times, exchanged glances that spoke volumes. They had seen this terrible scenario before. It was the story of a child trying to give birth to a child, of nature being pushed beyond its limits by the cold, unyielding demands of human ambition and political necessity. For 18 unending hours, Margaret labored in a realm of pure, undiluted agony. Her screams, initially sharp and human, echoed off the cold, unforgiving stone, a soundtrack to her torture. As the night wore on, those screams dissolved into ragged, hoarse cries, and then into something less than human, gasping, animalistic sounds of pure, primal suffering. The head midwife, Dame Gwenllian, a woman whose hands had ushered both life and death into the world, used every technique in her ancient arsenal. She used herbs, positioning, and prayers, but the child would not come. As a grey, wintry dawn began to bleed through the narrow windows, a terrible truth became apparent. Margaret's strength was failing. Her pulse fluttered weakly. Her body was shutting down. The most desperate of decisions was made, to attempt a manual extraction. It was a horrific, brutal procedure, a final, violent gamble that might, by some miracle, save the child at the almost certain cost of the mother's life. When the baby boy finally emerged, torn from Margaret's shattered body, the chamber fell into a breathless, terrifying silence. The infant was unnaturally pale, limp, and covered in the evidence of the brutal struggle. He did not breathe. For a long, heart-stopping moment, the only sound was Margaret's own weak, ragged gasps from the bed. Then Dame Gwenllian, with hands that refused to tremble, cleared the baby's mouth and throat, and she breathed a puff of air into his tiny lungs. The sound that followed was thin, reedy, and furious. It was the angry wail of Henry Tudor, the future King of England. It was the sound of a dynasty being born. Margaret, drifting in and out of consciousness, her body a map of ruin, heard her son's first cry as if from a great distance. It was a sound that pierced the haze of her pain and exhaustion, a promise of a future she had nearly died to secure. In the days that followed, Dr. Caerleon's examination confirmed the worst. The damage was extensive and he knew permanent. There were severe internal injuries and tearing that would never fully heal. She would suffer the consequences for the rest of her life. Most devastatingly, she would never bear another child. This single traumatic birth had ended her childbearing years before they had even properly begun. At the age of 13, Margaret Beaufort, mother to a future king, was effectively barren in a world where a woman's worth was measured by the sons she could produce. But if Margaret's body was broken, her spirit, her formidable will, had been tempered in that fire until it was as hard as the steel of a king's crown. Her physical recovery was slow and agonizing. But as she convalesced in the months following Henry's birth, a new resolve solidified within her. The girl was gone. The politician was born. She understood with crystal clarity that her son, this tiny vulnerable boy, represented the last, best hope for the Lancastrian cause, and she would become his general, his strategist, his unshakable foundation. Her first move was one of pure pragmatic survival. In 1458, her body barely recovered. She married again, this time to Sir Henry Stafford, a younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. It was not a marriage of passion, but of protection. It offered safety and a roof for herself and her precious son, even if it meant sharing a bed with a man whose political loyalties sometimes wavered dangerously, close to her enemies. After Stafford's death in 1471, she played her final marital card, marrying the immensely powerful and politically astute Thomas Stanley. Lord Stanley. An alliance with Stanley was a masterstroke. It gave her access to vast intelligence networks, immense political influence, and military resources that would one day prove crucial. She was building an army, not of soldiers but of alliances, patiently weaving a web of power with her son at its center. When Richard III seized the throne in 1483, the game changed entirely. His actions, particularly the mysterious disappearance of his own nephews, the princes in the Tower, shattered his legitimacy and turned the stomach of the nation. In that moment of crisis, Margaret saw not just terrible danger, but unprecedented opportunity. Her son Henry's once distant claim to the throne, filtered through her own Beaufort bloodline, suddenly looked like the only viable, morally acceptable alternative to a king widely suspected of being a child murderer. From the shadows, Margaret began to plot with breathtaking audacity. She communicated with exiled Lancastrians, secured funding from the French king, and most importantly, she worked on her husband, Lord Stanley. She played on his ambition, his caution and his loyalty, twisting them all to her purpose. The betrayal she orchestrated on the field at Bosworth on August 22, 1485, was years in the making. Stanley's forces, whose intervention was the product of Margaret's careful manipulation, turned the tide of the battle. It was her strategy, her patience that made her son, Henry Tudor, the King of England. After a lifetime of separation, exile and decades of patient, ruthless planning, Henry Tudor had triumphed. Margaret became My Lady the King's mother, the most powerful woman in England. She had her palaces, her wealth, her influence. But she never again enjoyed the simple, uncomplicated relationship of mother and child that had been stolen from her by political necessity from the moment of his traumatic birth. She lived to see her son secure his throne, marry Elizabeth of York, and unite the warring houses of Lancaster and York under the new Tudor rose. She held her grandson, the future Henry VIII, in her arms. She died in 1509, her life's ambition complete, her arc of destiny fulfilled, having come full circle from the blood-soaked birthing chamber at Pembroke Castle. The cost of Margaret Beaufort's staggering success can never be fully measured. She sacrificed her body on the altar of dynastic continuity, giving England a king at the price of her own physical well-being. She sacrificed motherhood itself to the demands of political survival, watching her only son grow up from a distance, a pawn in her own game. She traded any chance of personal happiness for the cold, hard currency of power and legacy the 13-year-old girl screaming in that lonely Welsh castle could never have conceived of the iron-willed woman she would be forced to become. She was the king's mother, the founder of a dynasty that would define an age, the woman who helped end 30 years of civil war through a maternal love that was transmuted, through unimaginable pressure, into political gold. In Westminster Abbey, where she lies in a magnificent tomb of black marble, visitors can read the Latin inscription that speaks of her piety and her extraordinary achievements, but they cannot hear the echoes. They cannot hear the ghost of that long-ago scream, the sound of a child in unimaginable agony, bringing forth the future of a nation. That sound and the story of sacrifice it began remains forever trapped in the ancient stone of a Welsh castle, where the Atlantic waves still crash relentlessly against the cliffs, and the wind still howls, carrying the whispers of the girl who suffered so that a dynasty might live.